The wedding dress is so heavy that 6-year-old Isabel of France struggles to walk under its weight draped in golden silks and jewels. Hundreds of candles flicker against the Gothic windows of St. Paul's Cathedral, and the booming sound of the organ echoes through the stone halls. Nobles from 2 kingdoms watch as the child bride approaches the altar, where a 29-year-old man stands waiting to make her his queen. But what's about to unfold is a horrifying truth about Europe's youngest political victim, something medieval chroniclers tried to bury for centuries. What really happened behind palace walls when children became pawns in royal games is more disturbing than you can imagine. And here's the chilling part. This wasn't some distant barbaric practice from faraway lands. This was London, this was France. And it was at the height of medieval civilization. What I'm about to reveal will completely change the way you understand how European royalty treated their own children. I hope everyone helps me with a like and a subscription, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. On November 9th, 1389, the Louvre Palace echoed with screams, but not from childbirth. King Charles VI of France was having another episode. He was convinced he was made of glass that any touch would shatter him into 1,000 pieces. Palace guards were ordered to stay back as the king, trembling in fear, hid in corners, claiming invisible enemies were hunting him through his halls. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria gave birth to her 4th daughter. The midwives exchanged concerned looks. Another girl, another mouth to feed, another political tool to be traded when the time was right. They named her Isabel, and from the moment she was born, she was not just a child, she was currency. Imagine that while you at 6 years old were worrying about making friends or learning how to read, Isabel was being raised to be a living treaty. Her toys weren't just dolls, they were miniature courts where she practiced diplomatic ceremonies. Her bedtime stories weren't fairy tales, they were lessons in statecraft. But to understand how a 6-year-old ended up betrothed to a man old enough to be her father, we need to expose the rotten heart of the French royal family. Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, hadn't always been insane. At 24, something snapped in his mind during a military campaign. One moment he was leading his army, the next he was attacking his own men, convinced they were assassins. His episodes came in waves. Sometimes he would be lucid for months, acting as the cultured king that France needed. But then, without warning, he would strip naked and run howling through the palace, or forget his own name, or worse, forget he had a wife and children at all. Medieval medicine had no answers. Physicians tried everything from bloodletting to exorcisms, but nothing worked. France was being ruled by a madman, and in the shadows opportunists circled like vultures. Isabel's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was the chief vulture. Where others saw tragedy in the king's madness, she saw opportunity. Every episode meant more power she could seize, more gold she could hoard, more lovers she could entertain while her husband cowered in his chambers, and it only gets worse. The court chroniclers remember these were people hired to glorify. The royals couldn't even hide their disgust. One wrote that Isabeau cared more for her jewels than her children, more for her pleasures than her prayers. Another claimed she had at least 3 lovers, while her husband suffered in his episodes, sometimes even entertaining them in rooms just a few doors away. Adjacent to where Charles VI was being restrained, this was the woman raising Isabel her model of motherhood. The Louvre Palace, where Isabel spent her childhood, was a labyrinth of intrigue. 2 factions, the Armagnacs and the Biandians, battled for control of the Mad King, and assassination attempts were a common occurrence. Poison was always a lingering threat, and noble children didn't play in gardens. They played in fortified courtyards guarded by watchful eyes, always wary of crossbow bolts. Isabel learned to recognize the signs of her father's approaching madness before she could even read. She could tell by the way his eyes darted around the room, the trembling in his hands, the ominous silence that signaled everyone needed to evacuate before the violence began. At just 4 years old, she witnessed her father try to kill her mother, convinced Isabel was a demon sent to steal his soul. But here's the part of the story historians won't tell you. The French court kept detailed records, and hidden within those dusty ledgers is a heartbreaking entry from 1394. Isabel was just 5 when the royal treasury paid for iron bars to be installed on her chamber's windows. Not for decoration, not for security against outside threats, but because a 5-year-old princess had tried to jump. Even at that young age, death seemed preferable to the life she was living. Her traumatic childhood was just the beginning of a much darker fate. In 1395, messengers arrived from England with a proposal that would solve many of France's problems and create a lifetime of nightmares for one little girl. Richard II of England, desperate for peace after the death of his first wife Anne of Bohemia, had no heirs, no allies, and a treasury drained by constant warfare with France. He needed money, he needed peace, and he needed both immediately. The French council saw an opportunity to buy nearly 30 years of peace with English gold, all for the price of one 6-year-old girl. The negotiations were where this story took a truly monstrous turn. Imagine this grown men draped in velvet robes sitting around mahogany tables, bargaining over a childlike merchants at a slave market. The English ambassadors were initially hesitant about Isabel's age 6, was shockingly young even by medieval standards. Most royal brides were at least 12 old enough to survive childbirth. But the French negotiators had a chilling counter-argument. They explained that taking Isabel young meant Richard could shape her according to his preferences. She would grow up knowing only English customs and desires. In their words, she would be more completely his. They were talking about grooming a state-sanctioned, internationally negotiated grooming of a 6-year-old child. The English wanted to inspect her first as if she were livestock. French courtiers were ordered to parade Isabel before the English delegation. They examined her teeth, her posture, her hair. They made her walk back and forth to ensure she had no physical deformities. One English lord was overheard remarking that she would ripen beautifully. She was 6 years old. The final deal was struck in the summer of 1396. France agreed to provide 800,000 livres, an astronomical sum equal to nearly 2 years of English royal revenue. In return, Richard II would get Isabel a 28-year truce and the return of captured French territories. But the cruelest detail was hidden in the marriage contract preserved in the English National Archives. While the marriage would not be consummated until Isabel reached the proper age, Richard was granted all other rights of a husband immediately. What were those rights? The right to control where she lived, what she learned, who she could associate with, the right to share her bed. Because medieval nobility believed young brides should grow accustomed to their husband's presence, Richard was granted absolute authority over every aspect of her existence. In that moment, Isabel's childhood was signed away with the stroke of a quill. When Isabel was told she was going to be Queen of England, she asked a question that her governess later recorded in private letters. "Will I be able to bring my dolls?" Just think about that. A 6-year-old's first concern about becoming queen was whether she could keep her toys. Because that's what she was, still a child who played with dolls, still needing help to braid her hair, still crying when she scraped her knees. The French court threw itself into wedding preparations with obscene enthusiasm. Seamstresses worked day and night creating a trousseau fit for a queen, 12 wedding dresses, 40 ceremonial gowns, jewels that had belonged to 3 generations of French queens, all sized for a 6-year-old. Isabeau of Bavaria personally oversaw the preparations, showing more interest in her daughter's wedding than she had ever shown in her upbringing. Why? Because this was her triumph. She had successfully traded her daughter for peace and profit. The court poets composed verses praising her wisdom, but no one wrote verses for the little girl being packaged for export. October 1396 saw the farewell ceremony at the Louvre, a masterpiece of political wit, and Charles VI, in a rare moment of clarity, blessed his daughter, tears streaming down his face. Witnesses reported that he held her so tightly they had to pry his arms open. He whispered something in her ear that made her sob uncontrollably. We'll never know what a mad king said to his 6-year-old daughter in their final moment together, but servants reported that Isabel screamed for her father. ChatGPT said, until her voice gave out long after the palace had faded from view, the journey from Paris to Calais took 2 weeks, a harrowing 2 weeks for a terrified child being carried further and further from everything she'd ever known. Her French attendants later testified that she barely ate or slept clutching a small wooden doll, her favourite until her fingers bled from the pressure. At Calais, the handover was conducted like a hostage exchange because, honestly, that's exactly what it was. The English delegation had erected a massive tent city on the beach with silk pavilions stretching as far as the eye could see, each flying Richard VI's personal standard. Musicians played, acrobats performed. It was a festival atmosphere with everyone celebrating except the 6-year-old girl at the centre of it all. The moment of transfer was carefully choreographed. French nobles walked Isabel to the exact centre of a measured field where English nobles met. Words were spoken in Latin, words Isabel didn't understand. Papers were signed, gold changed hands, and just like that, she belonged to England. But it was what happened next that shattered any fairy tale narrative. The English escorts immediately separated Isabel from her French attendants. Her governess, who had raised her from birth, was sent back to France. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced with English women, who spoke a language she didn't understand. Even her beloved dog, her pet, which she'd been promised would accompany her, was taken away because Richard didn't like small dogs. In a single hour, every familiar thing in Isabel's life was stripped away. The journey from Calais to London was a blur of strange faces and incomprehensible words. The English tried to make it festive. Every town they passed through was ordered to celebrate their new queen. But imagine being 6, exhausted, terrified, and having strangers shout at you in a language you don't understand while bells ring and crowds press in from all sides. Isabel later told her confessor she thought they were taking her to her execution. In her child's mind, all this ceremony could only mean death. And in a way, she wasn't entirely wrong. London, November 1396. The city had never seen a spectacle like it. Richard II spent a fortune he didn't have to impress his subjects and intimidate his enemies. Westminster Palace was draped in gold cloth. The Thames was crowded with decorated barges. Every church bell in the city rang from dawn to midnight. St. Paul's Cathedral had been transformed into something from a fever dream. Thousands of candles, incense thick enough to make eyes water banners showing the joined arms of England and France. The altar was covered in enough gold to buy a small army, and at the centre of it all was a 29-year-old man waiting to marry a 6-year-old child. Richard II cut an impressive figure, tall, elegant, with the refined features that court painters adored. He wore robes worth more than most nobles' entire estates. By all accounts, he was nervous, but not for the reasons you'd hope. See, Richard wasn't nervous about marrying a child, he was nervous about the politics. Would this marriage buy him enough time to crush his domestic enemies? Would the French actually pay the full dowry? Would his nobles accept a queen who couldn't produce heirs for at least 6 more years? The moral implications of what was happening didn't seem to cross his mind. When they brought Isabel into the cathedral, the crowd gasped, not in admiration but in shock. She was so small the ceremonial robes dragged behind her, requiring 2 attendants to carry the train. The crown specially made for her child-sized head slipped constantly and had to be adjusted repeatedly. She was led down the aisle more like a prisoner than a bride, while hundreds of nobles watched, and ambassadors from across Europe took notes. At the altar, her bridegroom waited with the patience of a spider. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, having to kneel to reach Isabel's level. When he asked if she consented to the marriage, she didn't answer. She couldn't. Terror had stolen her voice. An English lady-in-waiting had to prompt her, whispering the required words until Isabel repeated them in a voice so quiet only those closest could hear. "I will." 2 words that sealed her fate, words that sentenced her to a lifetime of captivity. When it came time for the rings, Richard's hands completely engulfed Isabel's. Witnesses reported that she flinched when he touched her. The ring, though specially made for a child, still had to be forced onto her tiny finger. She winced, a small sound of pain that no one in the vast cathedral seemed to notice. The ceremony continued. The kiss of peace, a traditional part of medieval weddings, was altered. Richard kissed Isabel on the forehead instead of her lips, the only merciful gesture in the entire grotesque performance. And then it was over. Isabel of France was now Isabella of England, queen consort and wife to a man who could have been her father. The crowd cheered, bells rang, and coins were thrown to the poor in celebration. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old girl stood at the altar, tears streaming down her face, wondering why everyone was so happy about the worst day of her life. The wedding feast at Westminster Hall was a grand affair, 2,000 guests eating courses that could have fed entire villages for months. Swans stuffed with peacock boars' heads decorated with gold leaf wines from across the known world. Entertainment included musicians, jesters, and acrobats performing death-defying stunts. Isabel sat at the high table in a chair specially built to raise her to adult height. She didn't eat. She couldn't. The Archbishop of York, seated nearby, later wrote that she spent the entire feast staring at a fixed point on the wall, as if her soul had departed and left only the shell behind. But the real horror was yet to come. Medieval wedding nights were public affairs, not the consummation, but the bedding ceremony. The bride would be undressed by her ladies, blessed by priests, and put to bed. The groom would join her. The curtains would be drawn, and the marriage would be considered complete. For Isabel, they modified the tradition. She was put to bed in her shift, clutching the one French doll they'd allowed her to keep. Richard entered the chamber in his nightclothes, and the courtiers watched as he climbed into bed with the 6-year-old child. The curtains were drawn, the courtiers left, and for the first time Isabel was alone with her husband. What happened that night, we don't know. Richard later swore that the marriage wasn't consummated, and there's no evidence to contradict him. But we do know that the next morning Isabel's ladies found her huddled in a corner of the massive bed, refusing to speak or move. She didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, her first words were in French, asking when she could go home. The answer, of course, was never. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Richard then, despite being part of this monstrous arrangement, seems to have treated Isabel with surprising gentleness. After the wedding, he set her up in her own household at Windsor Castle, surrounded by French-speaking attendants he'd specifically recruited. He visited her regularly, but kept separate bedchambers. He showered her with gifts, not jewels or gowns, but toys and books and a small white pony she named Blanche. Was this kindness, or was it grooming? Historians still debate. What we do know is that Isabel slowly began to trust her husband. She learned English, participated in court ceremonies, and even started to show affection for Richard, calling him my Lord Uncle, a child's attempt to understand their relationship. Richard, for his part, seemed genuinely fond of her. He commissioned portraits where they were shown together, him seated and her standing beside him, her tiny hand resting on his arm. He wrote poems about innocence and protection. He violently punished anyone who showed disrespect to the Queen. But don't mistake this for a redemption arc. A kind captor is still a captor, and a gentle predator is still a predator. A child bride treated well is still a child bride. Life at the English court settled into a bizarre routine. Isabel attended state functions where she was displayed like an exotic pet. Foreign ambassadors would comment on how well trained she was, how she could already recite English poetry and perform complex court dances. There's much more to Isabel's story, including 3 more shocking revelations about what happened to child brides in medieval courts. But before we continue, if you're finding this hidden history as disturbing as I did when I uncovered it, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. I release new investigations every week exposing the dark truths about historical figures, and trust me, Isabel's story is just the beginning of what the history books don't want you to know. No one mentioned that Isabel still played with dolls in Prévert, that she still had nightmares that made her scream for a father an ocean away. Her ladies had to coax her to eat because she was wasting away from homesickness. The English nobles were divided in their treatment of her. Some, seeing which way the political winds blew, fawned over the child queen. Others, resentful of French influence and the massive dowry that had bankrupted the crown, treated her with barely concealed contempt. One incident recorded by a chronicler but often omitted from sanitized histories shows the daily horror of Isabel's existence. During a state banquet, a drunk nobleman made a crude joke about when the queen would be ready for breeding. The hall erupted in laughter. Isabel, not understanding the sexual implications but knowing she was being mocked, burst into tears and fled the table. Richard had the nobleman flogged nearly to death, but he didn't stop the culture that allowed such jokes to be made. Meanwhile, back in France, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Charles VI's madness grew worse, and Isabeau of Bavaria's corruption grew bolder. The country spiraled towards civil war. The 800,000 livres of Isabel's dowry, meant to secure lasting peace, was spent within 2 years on Richard's lavish building projects and failed military campaigns. Isabel received letters from home heavily censored by English officials. She wrote back some of it, surviving in fragments. "I pray for you all daily." One letter reads, "I'm a well-treated, but my heart remains with France." Another, more heartbreaking, says, "Do you still remember me? I fear you have forgotten your Isabel." She was 7 years old already, worrying about being forgotten. Then in 1309 everything changed. In the span of a few bloody months, Richard II's rule had grown increasingly tyrannical. He had exiled or executed many of his nobles, ruled without that parliament, and spent money England didn't have on projects England didn't need. The final straw came when he seized the lands of Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. Henry raised an army and Richard's support evaporated like morning mist in August. In 1309, the king who had married a child for power found himself a prisoner in his own kingdom. But think about what this meant for Isabel. She woke up one morning as Queen of England, and by nightfall she was a 10-year-old widow. Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle, where months later he would die, under mysterious circumstances, starved to death, some say, or murdered with an axe, say others. Isabel wasn't allowed to see him, wasn't allowed to say goodbye. Goodbye. The last time Isabel saw her husband, the man who had been both captor and protector nightmare and only friend, he was being dragged away in chains while she screamed his name. Now she belonged to a new king, one who saw her not as a child to protect, but as a problem to solve. Henry IV faced a dilemma. Isabel was still the Queen of England in the eyes of the law. The French dowry had been spent, and sending her home meant returning money that no longer existed. Keeping her meant housing and feeding a living reminder of the previous regime. His solution was as cruel as it was practical. Isabel became a prisoner at Havering Palace. Oh, they didn't call it imprisonment. She was an honoured guest forbidden from leaving, receiving uncensored letters, or having French visitors. For 3 years she lived in gilded captivity. Think about that, from age 10 to 13, when children should be learning, growing and playing. Isabel was a political prisoner in a foreign country, one that had murdered the only person who'd ever shown her kindness. The letters she wrote during this period are heartbreaking. Hidden in archives and dismissed by historians as unimportant, they reveal a child slowly losing hope. "I am forgotten by all," she wrote to an aunt. "I speak to the walls in French so I do not forget the sound. I dream of home but wake to prison." Another letter to her father. "They tell me you are ill again. I pray for your recovery. I pray you remember you have a daughter in England who loves you still." But the most devastating letter was never sent. Found hidden in her chambers after she finally left, it was addressed to Richard. "My lord, they say you are dead, but I do not believe it. You promised you would protect me always. I wait for you still. Your Isabel." A 13-year-old girl waiting for a dead man to save her. That's what English politics had created. Henry IV tried various solutions to the Isabel problem. First, he proposed she marry his son, the future Henry V. She refused with a vehemence that shocked the court. The quiet, compliant child queen had found her voice, and it said, "I am Richard's widow. I will marry no English girl." Imagine the courage it took for a 13-year-old girl imprisoned and powerless defying a king who had already killed one monarch. Henry's next plan was crueler. If she wouldn't remarry, she'd remain in England indefinitely, a hostage to ensure French good behaviour. But Isabel had learned from her years at court. She knew how to play the game. She smuggled letters to France through sympathetic servants, feigned illness to gain access to French-speaking physicians who could carry messages, and used her status as Dowager Queen to demand certain privileges, then used those privileges to build a network of supporters. This wasn't a passive princess waiting for rescue. This was a teenager who'd survived 2 kings and was determined to survive a third. Finally, the French court, pressured by Isabel's increasingly desperate letters and needing to save face, demanded her return. Negotiations dragged on for 2 more years. Henry wanted compensation for the dowry. France wanted compensation for Isabel's imprisonment. Back and forth while a girl's youth withered away in captivity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Isabel's mad father, Charles VI, had a moment of clarity. For one brief shining day, the fog lifted from his mind. He remembered he had a daughter in England. He remembered she'd been sold for peace, and he flew into a rage that terrified even his handlers. "Bring her home!" he screamed. And for once the court listened to their mad king. In 1401, at age 13, Isabel finally returned to France. But the girl who came back was not the child who had left. Contemporary accounts describe her as aged beyond her years, marked by melancholy, and most tellingly forever looking over her shoulder, as if expecting capture. The reunion with her family was not the joyful homecoming she had dreamed of for 5 years. Charles VI didn't recognize her. The madness had claimed him again by the time she arrived. Isabeau of Bavaria saw not a daughter, but a political asset that had depreciated in value. A used queen was worth less on the marriage market than a fresh princess. Slio. Isabel was home French soil, French voices, French food. For a brief moment, she might have believed the nightmare was over. She was wrong. The nightmare of Dieppe was just changing shape. France in 1401 was even more chaotic than when she had left. The Armagnac-Beaugrandian civil war had erupted in full. Paris changed hands regularly, each faction bloodier than the last. The Mad King was a puppet. The Queen Mother was openly allied with France's enemies. The treasury was empty. The people starved. And Isabel, she was damaged goods in need of rehabilitation. Isabeau's solution was swift and mercenary. In 1406, she arranged Isabel's marriage to Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was a poet, a dreamer, and close to Isabel in age and temperament. By all accounts, it was the first time in her life Isabel experienced something approaching love. Charles was gentle where Richard had been possessive. He was young where Richard had been aging. Isabel's brief happiness was marked by a new chapter. After marrying Charles, Duke of Orleans in 1406, Isabel found something resembling love for the first time. Charles, a poet and dreamer, was young and gentle, offering Isabel the tenderness that had been withheld from her for so many years. In 1409, Isabel gave birth to a daughter, Jean. Witnesses said she glowed with a joy they had never seen before, transformed by motherhood. She had someone to love, someone to protect, a love that was truly hers. But Isabel's happiness, like everything in her life, was never meant to last. The birth was difficult, too difficult for a body worn down by stress, malnutrition and trauma. The same physicians who couldn't save her mad father couldn't save her either. As Isabel lay dying at the young age of 20, she made one final request. She wanted to hold her daughter one more time. They brought the infant Jean to her, and Isabel whispered something in the baby's ear. No one heard what she said. Her last words were for her daughter alone. Isabel died on September 13th, 1409, at just 20 years old, twice a queen, a prisoner, a pawn, and briefly a mother, who knew love. The court chroniclers, however, spent just 3 lines on her death. 3 lines for a woman who'd been sold at 6, widowed at 10, imprisoned until 13 and dead at 20. 3 lines that focused on the political implications of her death, not the human tragedy of her life. But we know the truth now. Hidden in archives, in private letters, in the margins of official histories where scribes sometimes told the truth, we know what was done to Isabel of France. She wasn't a princess in a fairy tale. She was a child sacrificed on the altar of politics. Her suffering wasn't noble or meaningful. It was preventable cruelty dressed up in silk and called diplomacy. Every time we romanticize the medieval period, every time we sigh over knights, ladies and courtly love, we erase victims like Isabel. Children who were bought and sold, women traded like livestock, human beings whose entire existence was subordinated to the whims of powerful men. The proof is overwhelming. The wedding contracts that specified the ownership of a child, the financial records showing the price paid for a 6-year-old girl, the letters begging for freedom, the testimony of servants who saw her tears, the medical records of a body broken by a lifetime of trauma. This was not an anomaly. Isabel's story was repeated hundreds of times across medieval Europe. Margaret of Anjou married at 15, Philippa of England betrothed at age 1, countless girls whose names we don't even know because they weren't deemed important enough to record. But Isabel we remember not because her story was unique, but because enough fragments survived for us to piece together the truth. She stands for all of them, children sacrificed for their parents' ambitions. When you see medieval romances on screen, remember Isabel crying for her father as she was carried to England. When historians talk about the glory of chivalry, remember the 6-year-old asking if she could bring her dolls to her wedding. When people romanticize arranged marriages as something from different times, remember a 20-year-old dying from a body broken by a lifetime of being owned. Isabel of France was murdered not with a sword or poison, but with politics. Not in a day, but across 14 years of systematic destruction. Her childhood was murdered at 6, her freedom at 10, her hope at 13, and finally her body gave up at 20. She left behind a daughter who would grow up to face her own political marriage, her own reduction to currency in the games of powerful men. The cycle continued because that's what cycles do when no one stops them. But we can stop romanticizing them. We can call them what they were: child abuse sanctioned by church and state, human trafficking dressed up in ceremony, the destruction of innocence in the name of power. The next time someone tells you about the romance of medieval times, tell them about Isabel. Tell them about the 6-year-old bride who paid for peace with her childhood. Tell them about the letters begging to come home. Tell them about the 20-year-old who died never having lived a single day for herself. That's the real medieval period. That's the truth behind the castles and crowns. That's the horror we've spent centuries trying to forget. But Isabel deserves to be remembered not as a queen, not as a political symbol, but as a child who should have been protected and wasn't. As a girl who should have been loved and was instead sold. As a woman who found love too late to save her. Her gravestone reads, Isabel of Valois, Queen of England, Duchess of Orleans. It should read, Isabel, victim of a world that saw children as property. She was 6 years old in a wedding dress that weighed more than she did, and nobody saved her. That's the horror that should haunt us. Not ghosts, not monsters, not things that go bump in the night, but the real horror of real people doing unconscionable things and calling it civilization. Isabel of France, remember her name, remember her story, and remember that the only thing necessary for such evil to flourish is for good people to look away and call it history. The little girl who asked if she could bring her dolls to her wedding deserves at least that much. If Isabel's story shocked you, you need to see what happened to Catherine Howard. Another child bride whose fate was even more horrifying. I've uncovered execution records that prove she wasn't the adulteress history claims. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.